Dr. Jane Fleishman is an accomplished sexuality educator, writer, program developer, and researcher. In 2016, at the age of 62, she received her doctorate in human sexuality from the Widener University Center for Human Sexuality Studies after a successful career as a consultant for a large public mental health system. In this fascinating interview with PFLAG Cape Cod's Rick Koonce, Fleishman delves deeply into the challenges that LGBTQ+ seniors face as they navigate the passages of advancing age and must deal with issues of health and wellness, self-esteem, companionship and intimacy, and continued sexual vitality and identity. Fleishman has long believed that it's important for members of the LGBTQ+ community to redefine their ideas of sexual vitality, beauty, and desirability, and to debunk old but enduring myths about sexuality and aging. Wrinkles and gray hair are as beautiful as a face without wrinkles, she says, adding, I'm on a campaign to invite people to love their aging queer bodies and to upend the narrative that the only kind of beauty is associated with youth. That, she says, is a binary way of looking at the world that doesn't serve you, me, or anybody else in the LGBTQ+ community. Jane Fleishman, welcome to Profiles in LGBTQ+ Courage. It's great to have you here today.
Thanks, Rick. I'm so excited to be with you. This is going to be fun.
Jane, you're a sexuality educator with a unique focus, which is really to promote the sexual well-being of older adults. I'm curious, how did you get into this line of work?
Rick, I had a wonderful career for 30 years. I was in the public sector. I was doing educational work. I was the director of medical education and staff development at a large psychiatric facility. It was fantastic work. I really felt like I was making a difference. And it was hard work. And when I hit 55, that was my number. And I was able to retire from that career after 30 years. And it was wonderful. But I wasn't really ready to stop making trouble, Rick. So I thought, why don't I go back to school? I didn't know if I could do it, but I wanted to challenge myself. And I wanted to go back to school in an area that I knew was somewhat contentious, problematic, difficult for people to understand, and taboo. And I love taboos. I've always loved taboo topics.
Good for you.
Makes my heart sing. And I've always been an activist, and I've been interested in so much about learning, and I have a curious nature. So I got my PhD in human sexuality at the age of 62. So it took me a few years. It was great. And I was on a fast track. I mean, I didn't want to stop because I knew that the longer it took me, the less possible it would be for me to pass my comprehensive exams. I just was really worried about that. So I found myself in the very last class, one of the professors said to us, so what are you all going to do with this learning? And some of the people in my class were in their 20s, some were in their 30s, some were as old as in their 40s, but not too many. And so I thought, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to be teaching. I'm a sexuality educator now. I'm going to transport all of the methodology I knew from teaching in mental health and other areas to this new content area about sexuality. But I didn't know quite what I was going to be focusing on until I did my dissertation. And I realized that my research interests were really about the most marginalized people in the older age group, which is LGBTQ elders. And we think of LGBTQ as one umbrella, but there's so many communities within that. And we can talk about that a bit later, I'm sure. But you know, Rick, from doing your podcast and from the work you've done and really just living your life, you know how rarely this population that I am a part of, that really I feel so dear to, is very rarely studied in any kind of positive way. All of the research that was out there about our sexuality as we age was something about how many problems we either caused or had. That gay men, for instance, were responsible for the AIDS crisis, that bisexuals were responsible for the AIDS crisis, that lesbians never had sex, and that gay men had too much sex, and that transgender people didn't even exist. So I knew that the research needed to be boosted in a way that could sort of illustrate how much celebration and cause for joy we could also have as we age sexually.
Going forward in your work as a sexuality educator, what are the challenges that any of us in the LGBTQ community face as we get older relative to sexual satisfaction, sexual attraction, and life contentment?
Part of the answer to that really is similar to what any older adult faces in terms of our sexual aging. Part of it is that we face ageism. Ageism is a hindrance and a barrier to feeling fully oneself. And if we pair ageism with the kind of taboos against sexuality for older adults, one of the researchers I love, Terry Gewirtz-Medan, calls it sexual ageism. And another researcher who I really love, who is a trans woman who wrote a great book a couple of years ago called Transsex. Sorry, it's more of a book for clinicians. But Lucy Fielding, who wrote the book, sort of reminded me that there are so many parallels here in terms of marginalization. Lucy talked about this term that I really appreciate, erotic privilege. So who gets to be desirable? So your sexual desire, but who gets to be desirable? And Lucy talks about, in terms of her book, people who are white, cis or cisgender, het or heterosexual, tall, thin, able-bodied, and get this, Rick, 18 to 35 years old. That's a really short window. I mean, I haven't been 35 in 35 years, and so that was the top. And so that's the beginning. And that kind of dovetails into your question a bit around what are the extra challenges that we face? Because, of course, anyone with a penis could have some kind of erection difficulties, maybe maintaining or even getting an erection. Anyone with a vulva could have vaginal dryness or thinning of the vaginal lining. But in addition, those of us who are LGBTQ elders face much more difficulties with our health care situation. And so many of us, because of, various life situations, have a disproportionate amount of chronic diseases as compared with our cisgender or heterosexual counterparts. We also know that discrimination can continue to exist even into our elderly years as LGBTQ members. For instance, for those of us who have to move into senior living or choose to move into senior living, for whom there is no housing that is specifically either LGBTQ friendly or LGBTQ identified, many people feel this real fear about having to come out again. We came out years ago and we really felt comfortable in our own communities. I remember when Del Martin and Phyllis Lyons said, if you're going to come out, move to a city. And so many of us came out and felt comfortable in cities, but then we had to move to a senior living community where we may not be the most comfortable. And so there's fears about discrimination as well.
So if I may, and I want to talk about that, but if we can back up, Jane, and talk a little bit about the topic of ageism, because
Sure.
my own feeling is that within the gay community, we do a lousy job of embracing anyone who is outside of those demographics that you outlined a few minutes ago. And I can remember being in my 20s and being told by older gay men that I better get all of the sex I can by the time I'm 30 because nobody's going to want to see me or be with me after 30. It was so, and I refused to believe it. And I was also told I would never find a long-term relationship. This was bogus information. I rejected it. I was despairing at the time because I didn't have a lot of role models. And I actually relied on a couple of straight counselors that I'd had to kind of buck me up. But I think that I'm going to take the gay community to task here a little bit, because I think even now in this world that's populated by dating apps and Grindr, it's like, and I find gay men of a certain age really doubting themselves and kind of sexually gaslighting themselves. Now, I'm 70. I don't feel 70. My partner, my husband, is 65. We don't think about being, quote, old. We think about, we have a wonderful life together in all respects. So I reject this ageism concept. But could you comment on that and what you think that the LGBTQ community needs to do to be more supportive of its own in all of its diversity?
Yeah, I can really resonate with what you're saying, Rick. I remember that there were remember when we used to have classified ads in the back of a newspaper?
Oh, yes, yes.
And there were lots of really very, ageist kinds of ads for, no fatties and no gray hair, that kind of thing. And it was ageist and really sizist. And so I think you're absolutely right. I think particularly for gay men, there's a real youth culture that unfortunately abridges a lot of people's feeling of wholeness and beautifulness and sense of self-worth and being lovable. I also notice that some of the older men in my workshops say, I don't want to just be a daddy. I want to find somebody who's my age,
Up here.
Right.
Yes.
Right. And then I've also had younger men come to my workshops. Just last week, I was in Minneapolis, and a young man came to my workshop, and he said, I love older men. That's who my lovers are. Can you teach me about them? And I said, well, how about asking them questions, and like be curious. And it was so funny, because he was like asking me as if I would be the expert on that. But I found an interesting thing, Rick. When lesbians get older, it's not the same thing. We have more of a reverence for what we call crones, someone who is an elder. In our community, we have a group called OLOC, organization called OLOC is Older Lesbians Organizing for Change. Actually, no, that's not I've been chided about this. It's Old Lesbians Organizing for Change, really embracing the old, right? Embracing that. And and OLOC is a national organization, and I think it's much harder for gay men, just like it's much harder for heterosexual women. It's interesting, right? There's a parallel here.
Yes.
I had never put that together until you said that. And I think, wrinkles and gray hair are really as beautiful as a face without wrinkles and with another color. And so I'm on a campaign to invite people to love their aging queer bodies and to love them as much as they can, and to really kind of upend the narrative that the only kind of beauty is youth, and that's a binary. And I really reject all binaries. I've learned so much from the trans community by remembering that youth does not equal beauty, and old does not mean ugly. We have to really find that multiplicity or the multidimensionality of all of us within that spectrum.
It's such a good point. And I want to ask you about this concept of aging and ageism, because, talking about being old, it seems to be described very subjectively or situationally. Who is, quote, old, and what do we mean by that? So at what age does one become old? Joe Biden is criticized for being 81, considered too old to be president. Donald Trump at 77, less so, but still to some extent. Meanwhile, we have Keith Richards and Mick Jagger of the Rolling Stones. They're both 80. Tony Fauci, who just took on a special professorship at Georgetown Medical School, he's 83. And then you have William Shatner and Joan Collins, both of Star Trek fame. They're 93 and 90, respectively, and they're still going. So what comes first? Do we remain youthful in spirit, if not necessarily in body, because of our attitude? Or is it genetics? Or is it circumstances? Or profession? What are your thoughts about that?
Rick, great question. Here's the thing. AARP, we all get their magazine, has lowered the age of subscribers. It's down to 40 now.
Oh my gosh.
So, hello. So that's a market. we're talking about a market there. If you walk down the aisle in your local drugstore, there are many different types of products called anti-aging this and that. I'm anti-aging, Rick. I believe that aging is part of life. And if we are fortunate enough to get to be in our 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and beyond, we have a lot to offer. Particularly for people in our community who lived through the AIDS crisis, I lost 11 friends in the 80s in Hartford, Connecticut, who were amazing young men in their 20s and 30s who succumbed to the virus before we really had any kind of cocktail or there was any available medication. When the COVID crisis occurred, I noticed that a lot of older people in our community were even more affected because it was like we were thinking about this crisis and remembering the last pandemic. That, of course, is not over yet, but for many of us, it's really past. Just like COVID is not over, but for many of us, it's past. And so I want to say that what we can learn is, and there was a wonderful book written about gay men in the AIDS crisis who lived through it as one generation, gay men who profited from it, who were a bit younger, who learned about safer sex and really, kind of demanded better medical treatment. And then another group of gay men who are even younger, who may or may not even have any relationship to the AIDS crisis and may not realize how important it is for the strides that we've made from the thousands of deaths that we had to incur. And I think that is a lesson that we can take, not only about ageism, but also about how we remember our histories, how we remember what struggles we've been through. And, after I did my research for my dissertation, I wrote a book, which you and I have talked about, called The Stonewall Generation. And, Rick, I needed to write that book because I wanted to hear the stories behind the statistics. The statistics were really helpful, as we've noted, and really useful for people who want to make maybe educational work better or policy work better. But I needed to hear the stories. I wanted to really, really get the illustration, the texture, the fabric behind the numbers. And what I learned from those stories was that people who have been through difficult times in the LGBTQ communities around sex, around aging, and also the people in my book were all activists. It was a moment in time where their own liberation was bound up in others, and that it was a collective sense of change that they were looking for, and that I share, and that we need to remember that when we talk about the Stonewall Rebellion or the Stonewall Tavern and what happened those 3 or 4 nights in 1969, 55 years ago, what we can really take from that is that people's lives were incontrovertibly changed, whether they were in Greenwich Village in New York City those nights or they were in any other part of the country.
Well, and you know that, of course, you interviewed David Bermudez and Bob Isidore, who I've also interviewed for this podcast series, and we've talked about how do you find, form, and sustain a long-term relationship, and I want to use that to kind of pivot and ask you a question about this, because certainly it relates to anyone in the LGBTQ community as they get older. What's your advice or perspective on how two people in one of these, quote, non-traditional relationships can keep the love alive, can keep the energy flowing, and what's the secret sauce, do you think, to sustaining intimacy, companionship, and cherishment, if you will?
Great. Don't brush your teeth at the same time. Close the door to the bathroom. Take 2 cars to parties. Remember that if you each have relationships in your own families, you need to give each other a break and not have to go to each other's family every single time there is a gathering. But levity aside, those are all really important, but levity aside, I believe that one of the keys to a long-term relationship is knowing the difference between responsive desire and spontaneous desire.
Please explain.
Yeah, sure. So spontaneous desire, and this was concepts developed years ago by the people at the Koonce Institute in Indiana, popularized recently by Emily Nagoski in her book, Come As You Are, which is a wonderful book. But the idea is, remember when we were in our 20s and just sort of newly awakening sexually, or in our 30s, wherever that time was in our lives. And, you could just meet somebody at the bar and you knew that that was someone, and you might not even make it back to the kitchen table, but you could throw your clothes off and literally jump on someone's bones on your kitchen table. And it was that easy and that exciting. Well, in a relationship, as you continue on with each other, you might not feel that same spontaneity. And so what I suggest is we think about the other side of desire, which is what these folks have called responsive desire, or thinking about what are the senses that I respond to, and what are the ways that any of the senses that I use, my eyes, my mouth, my nose, my ears, my hands, my feet, my sixth sense of my inner eye, whatever they are, how do I respond in a way sexually that might actually need a little bit of prodding, a little bit of kind of getting the engine going? And so, some researchers say just, take your clothes off, get into bed and see what happens. Start rubbing each other's feet, right? Whatever you can do that might be non-genital touch that would kind of develop a little bit of awareness of the sensation of feeling, and then maybe see where it goes to any sexual kind of touch. Others of us say, if you're nervous about getting into bed with someone, and it's someone that you've seen their bodies change over the years, and maybe you don't feel as attracted as you used to, ask them to wear something that you really love that they look great in. And if they comply, that's an amazing thing. And if you can get into bed with them with the lights a little dimmer, not so bright, with a candle going, with your Bluetooth speaker charged up, with your sex toys ready, with your lube ready, all of a sudden, and you've taken your medication, all of a sudden things change. And be patient, because as we get older, Rick, not only does the relationship get older, but our sense of timing gets longer. And so we may not be able to have an orgasm as quickly as we did, or an orgasm might not even be on the table for us at all. But patience and a bit of humor really helps. Joan Price, who's now 80, who was really the very first sex educator for older adults, she calls herself the senior sexpert, and she's great. Joan is amazing, and she's still writing and doing a lot of work. She says, one of the things we got to remember is it gets a little messy, but there's no expiration date on sex. And so have a sense of humor. Something might occur that you didn't realize was going to happen, but just roll with it. It's going to be okay. Have your tissues handy.
You're bringing up such great points. And I would add to that, I've heard long-term couples speak to this whole notion of exploring vulnerability.
Yeah.
And opening oneself up. And we all know that the nature of attraction changes over time. I mean, as a gay man, back in the day, you were primarily driven, at least initially, in terms of attraction by somebody else's physical appearance. And sometimes you weren't interested in a conversation. You were interested in an interaction. But I think for older people, the ability to open up to a partner and to be disclosing. And I'm thinking that even things like sex talk can be so provocative, and sexting can be a wonderful way for a couple to kind of gin things up with one another, and to kind of, put a little accelerant into the moment.
Totally. And also fantasy. We just did a really great episode on fantasy that we're going to be dropping I don't remember when it's going to drop, but part of our podcast about sex and aging. Because you see, sometimes fantasy for a couple that's been together for a long time can re-invoke, oh, that was that place we had sex when we were younger. Oh, I remember. That was hot. Or don't you wish we could? And then it's a fantasy, right? Then it becomes something that you don't have to actually reenact. You can just have it as a way, as you said, to kind of get things more excited. And you know what? There's nothing wrong with that. It's really totally available to all of us.
And I'm wondering if it's important to be affirmative about this and the idea
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
there is no expiration date to sexual desire, and maybe it smolders a little more than it flares. But, well, here's a question. Again, if we can pivot here, since this podcast is really focused on the whole swath of the LGBTQ plus community, could you talk a little bit, maybe just sort of a little bit of a commentary on gay men, lesbians, people who are bisexual, non-binary, transgender?
Sure.
What can each of them do that's maybe respective to their category in that spectrum, but that's important for people to be aware of as resources in terms of?
Sure. Well, I want to start with bisexuals. Bisexuals have been both invisible and maligned. And one of the most interesting things recently that happened was that I interviewed one of the leading architects of the bisexual rights movement from the 80s, Lani Ka'ahumanu. I interviewed her for my book. She's really cool, really interesting woman. She lives in Northern California, and she's of Hawaiian descent, as her name sounds. And she's really, really articulate and really reminding us always that bisexuals are part of this larger umbrella of LGB is right in there, QT. And so then I was interviewing a woman named Sarah Jen, who's a younger person, and she teaches at a university, and she's a bisexual rights academic researcher. And what she said was the invisibility that Lonnie experienced in the 80s, like Lonnie talked about coming out as a lesbian, and it was like in San Francisco, it was as if the bleachers were loaded with all these lesbians cheering her on. And later on, when she came out as bi, they shunned her. And it was very painful. And Sarah Jen, who has, now lived in a different part of this time, said the same kind of invisibility and misrepresentation exists today for bisexuals. So I thought that was really interesting and painful, right? Really painful. Something to be considering and something to think about, particularly when, if any of your listeners are healthcare providers or considering working with the LGBTQ elder population, talk about courage. It takes a lot of courage to come out as bi, particularly if you're in a relationship with someone of a different gender, and then you become erased. Your bisexuality, becomes erased. You become presumed or assumed to be heterosexual. So that's one thing that we can think about. Another thing, I was thinking for older lesbians, lesbians have been really, given a bad deck of cards in terms of this term that came up in the early to mid 80s, lesbian bed death. And,
Yes.
when I was a younger lesbian, I really believed it was real. I thought, okay, people said it must be real. It's like you read it in the paper, it must be real. Well, guess what? When I went to do my doctoral research, Rick, I did not know that this term had already been diffused and debunked in the literature. And I thought I was going to have to do that. Fortunately, other people who were far better researchers than I had been at that point had already debunked this term, but it didn't mean that it was erased from the imagination of lesbians, both in my generation and younger. I was on an airplane once, and for some reason, this always happens to me. I was listening to the conversation in the row behind me, how you're squished in an airplane. And these two younger lesbians were talking about how lesbian bed death still exists. And I turned around and I said, actually, let me tell you the story here. And so I feel like it's still there, and it really it erases people's sexuality, and it erases your sense of who you can be. And that, right, and remember that term about responsive desire. Well, thinking that it's all going to be spontaneous, and when it's not, I guess it's all over. And we used to
Yes.
say in 9 months or 6 months or 6 weeks, it
Yes.
was all over. It was horrible. So that's one thing for people to know in the lesbian community. For gay men, one of the things that I'm loving is, are you familiar with people in the Bears community?
Oh, yeah.
People who, and
Yes.
so I love when I go to P-Town a lot, Provincetown, and I love when it's Bear Week because first of all, there's all these guys walking around who don't have flat abs and six packs and, are, wearing cute, tiny little bikinis, but they look like the rest of us. They look kind of like they're wearing clothes. And I love that bears are so willing to kind of eschew this idea of the thin, perfect body, and that's all that's desirable.
Yes.
And I think if we can embrace more of that, that would be wonderful. In the kink community, one of the things that I'm learning with all of the work that I'm doing and the people that I'm hanging out with, I'm learning that people look good in leather even at an older age. So people who are interested in the leather community, there isn't that kind of discrimination against who you are based on appearance. There used to be a lot more mentoring going on in the kink community of older folks mentoring younger folks. Not so much anymore, and I wish we had more of that. I also think that the non-kink community can learn so much about issues like consent, prevention of sexual violence. I mean, there's so much.
And arousal and
Arousal,
yeah.
right,
Yeah.
right. So those are just some like tidbits, but I really think there's a lot more we could learn if we are willing to have frank discussions with each other. So like the young man who came over to me to say, teach me about older gay men, I'd say, don't ask me. Let's ask each other. Let's find out from each other what makes us tick, what makes us feel really terrible, what makes us feel really good. And remember, with the challenges around aging and sexuality, there are also going to be discoveries. There's always the other side of the hand.
Well, speaking of that, one of the other people that I interviewed for this podcast series is transgender and was married for 25 years as a man to their wife and has now made the transition and is living in the transgender community. And let's talk, if we can, a little bit about the non-binary transgender community, because they're basically where gays and lesbians were 50 years ago, at the social margins, misunderstood, marginalized, often demonized legally. So your thoughts there in terms of how a person who's non-binary or transgender, how can they positively embrace or explore their sexuality?
One of the major crux points for me when I was first coming out was around my orientation, who I was attracted to out there. I never really thought about my gender that much. I didn't think about who I was in here. I thought about what was going on out there. And I realized that for trans folks, both younger and older, the sense of needing to reconcile authenticity with what the rest of the world believes we are or thinks they know who we are can be such a flexion point and such a moment of real, I think, liberation, that for anyone who considers themselves non-binary or genderqueer or trans in any form, what I'd like to suggest is that we really remember that there is an infinite way of pleasuring oneself and pleasuring one's partner that are bound to no one's rules, that are bound to no highways. The road has not been created yet. And what we need to do is really make room for our non-binary and trans and genderqueer elders to be able to pursue their own sexual desires and their own sexual needs and their own sexual satisfaction in ways that maybe haven't been codified yet. And so let's be as expansive as we possibly can be, rather than being this narrowing, putting people in a box and you can only do X with X gender.
That's so beautifully said, Jane. And I'm reminded that Eros takes many forms, doesn't it?
Totally. Eros knew more than we knew, right?
So as we wrap up here, is there anything I have not asked you about sexuality in the context of aging or the LGBTQ community that has come up for you as we've talked that you think would be a nice way for us to wrap up today?
I was thinking that for folks who are either coming out as an elder or have been out for many years, the issues are going to be really different in terms of finding a partner or choosing where to even look for a partner. But I wanted to remind everyone who's listening that, and your podcast, you're all about courage in your podcast, Rick. And so the courage to love oneself is where the liberation really begins. And so for LGBTQ elders who are not in a relationship or have had a relationship where their partner has passed away or is suffering from a very long-term chronic disease that makes them less available, or for whom a divorce has occurred, whatever it is, that if they're feeling like it's only them, thank goodness you have your body, right? Wasn't it Oscar Wilde who said, Oscar Wilde said it much better than I could, but this is the body I've been given and I might as well make the most of it. We talk about self-love in my work, and self-love is the most important way to begin to find one's way to liberating oneself from the kinds of harassment, discrimination, bullying, and difficulties that might prevail on the outside. So love your own body first, get to know your body, and who knows, maybe you'll have another body to share with, but you're the body that you have to go to bed with each night.
I love that, Jane. And a therapist once said to me, it's about belonging to yourself.
There you go. Perfect.
So,
I love it.
Jane, thank you so much for this conversation today. If people who hear this podcast want to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
You can go to my website. It's just my name, Jane Fleishman, no C. .com, or I'm on LinkedIn. I have a podcast. I write blogs. I have lots of free materials on my website about LGBTQ aging sexually and also other kinds of sexual aging. And so if people want to write to me, they can send me an email. I love hearing from people, but I think the best way is just probably through my website.
Sounds wonderful. And I'll just plug your podcast, Our Better Half, which is accessible on that website as well.
Great.
Well, Jane Fleishman, thank you so much for being my guest today on Profiles in LGBTQ plus Courage. I think people are really going to take a lot away from this conversation today. So thank you.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to today's interview. Founded in 1973, PFLAG is the first and largest organization for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people and their parents, families, friends, and allies. We have over 400 chapters and more than 200,000 members and supporters nationwide. Our members come from every generation and live in cities, small towns, and rural areas across the United States. PFLAG is committed to creating a world where diversity is celebrated and all people are respected, valued, and affirmed. For more information about PFLAG, explore the rest of this website or visit PFLAG National at pflag.org.